Okay, welcome to today's seminar, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Stewart, who I met. No, actually, I came across her first when I designed my psychology of music module, and I came across her prize-winning paper. So she won a Young Investigator Prize with the Experimental Psychology Society, and for that she had to write a kind of review paper on amusia at the time. So I came across that paper and was really envious that such a young girl got this quite prestigious prize. And then subsequently, I met her again in Bangor at a conference. And we chatted again, and yeah, again I was very impressed by her. So give you a little bit of background about her. Lauren, she's only, can I say her age, because it's very, she's only 39 and she's already a professor, so I'm very envious of that as well. So she did her undergrad degree and her master's in neuroscience in Oxford. Then she moved to UCL, and she has quite an interesting pedigree. So she worked together with both Vincent Walsh and Uta Frith. You probably, most of you know these people, so she's really kind of quite impressive people she worked with in her PhD. After she did PhD, she went for postdoc in Newcastle University. She also had a traveling fellowship at Harvard Medical School, and so now she is professor at Goldsmiths College in London. I mean, if you look at her CV, I don't want to mention everything, but she has loads of publications. She's associate editor of a really prestigious journal. She has loads of big grants, as you know. There's some big grants. Yes. What else is important grants? Yeah. What's also important for me personally, she's not just working very hard, she's also a musician. So she plays the clarinet very well. And she just told me she also had a brief career as a keyboard player in the indie rock band Leonov. I don't know this band, but I think it's Leonov.
We only had 2 gigs, so you probably didn't know us.
Not a very famous band. And I think that's all the items I want to tell you about. Also, what I want to mention before we start the talk, she's not talking about amusia, because I sent an email around about amusia. So if anyone is here to just hear about the topic of amusia, now is your chance to she will talk about earworms today, but I think it's actually a much more interesting topic. So welcome to give the seminar here and enjoy your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ines, and for this introduction, generous introduction. Of course, it's not true that I've got many prestigious grants. I wish that was the case. So I think she has exaggerated too much. Today I'm going to talk to you about earworms, or what we kind of more dryly call spontaneous musical imagery. This has occupied me for the last sort of 3 or 4 years or so, trying to understand something about this phenomenon of inner music, and particularly the kind of inner music that you can't predict, that just kind of happens. It's something that the general public seem to resonate with. People say, yeah, I know what you mean, I've got a tune in my head all the time. Why have we got this inner music? What's it good for? What are its origins? How can we study this rather tricky thing that relies on us actually asking people about something that's internal? Okay, so I actually not sure I would recommend it as a topic for investigation, because it's extremely ethereal and difficult to get a handle on, but that's kind of what the challenge is, I suppose, and we have to sort of try to get a bit creative in terms of how we approach it. So at Goldsmiths, I lead a research group called Music, Mind and Brain Group, and we've got a fairly new website, musicmindbrain.com, where you can see some of our current projects, our public engagement work and our publications. And I'm also co-director of a master's in Music, Mind and Brain. That's a very vibrant postgraduate program with many international students trying to understand the nature of musical experience, both cognitively and in terms of the biology of that. So Goldsmiths is a very nice place to do the science of something creative like music, because it's predominantly an arts and humanities college, and it's relatively small compared to places like UCL, so it's easy to sort of work across disciplines, and it's been a very nice fit for me personally. Lots of people have contributed to the work I'm going to talk about today. Vicky Williamson, she's now moved on to a fellowship at University of Sheffield. My PhD student Kelly at the top in the middle, Kelly Jakubowski, Nicola Ferrugia, they've been all people employed on my Leverhulme grant. And then this is Rodri Cusack in bottom left, who's from University of Western Ontario, who we brought on board to help us with some neuroimaging work we've been doing with earworms. A couple more students, Georgina Floridou, Sagar Jilka, and Daniel Mullensiefen, who co-directs the master's program with me, and he's an expert on the kind of musicology, thinking about the structural features of tunes that become earworms. Let me give you an overview of what I'll talk about now. What is spontaneous music imagery, first of all? Why do I find it to be of interest? What do we know about it from other people's work? What questions have we addressed so far? What questions would we still like to address? And just a few remarks about bigger picture considerations about how it all fits together. Okay, I don't know if you can read this, but this sort of encapsulates what is spontaneous musical imagery. The cartoon says, why is it I can recall a cigarette ad jingle from 25 years ago, but I just can't remember what I got up to do? So it's a extremely sort of common experience. We have been talking about it in terms of involuntary musical imagery, or INMI, small snippets of tunes that occur involuntarily, repeat on a loop without conscious effort. So this looping quality seems to be a very constant feature of inner musical imagery. It is distinct from musical hallucinations, where people cannot distinguish between actual real music that's being played in the environment versus the music that's in their head. And if you've read, any of you have read the book by Oliver Sacks, Musicophilia, he talks about people who run around the house trying to silence the radio that they think is playing this music when it actually comes from their own heads. Of course, when you have an earworm, I'm sure most of you know the experience, you're very aware that it's something that's internally generated. It's also distinct from deliberate voluntary imagery. So this is the idea that you can deliberately summon a particular tune to mind because you want to hear it again, or if you're a musician, you might be going over something in your head as a form of rehearsing it for your practice. Colloquially, the term earworm comes from the German word Ohrwurm. It's also been termed sticky music, intrusive songs, brainworms, or stuck-on syndrome, all pretty much the same thing. It's been in the literature for more than 100 years. In popular culture, Mark Twain talks about a character whose life was kind of ruined by having this tune in the head, and Arthur C. Clarke wrote a story as well about a similar experience, somebody who goes a bit crazy because of a tune in the head. Oliver Sacks thinks that earworms might be on the rise due to the ubiquity of recorded music. So we're consuming so much more music that literally there's sort of an overspill, and that's why we're generating music involuntarily. And although the term earworm came into popular parlance in 2012, this dictionary notes that it was first used in 1802. So what do we know in a research sense? It's a relatively new field of inquiry. So the first paper was a very personal account by Stephen Brown called The Perpetual Musical Soundtrack, and he was writing about his own experiences and sort of describing the quality of his involuntary imagery. Earworms have been explored as a phenomenon in their own right, but also as a window onto spontaneous cognition in general. So you might be familiar with literature on self-generated thought, which is said to occupy 40% of our waking thoughts. So a lot of the time, our brain is elsewhere, not necessarily focused on what our sort of present environment dictates that we should be doing. And a field of sort of spontaneous cognition includes mind wandering, which has become a very hot topic recently, but also spontaneous semantic and autobiographical memory. So some of you might be familiar with the work of Dorte Berntsen, who's done a lot of this work on spontaneous autobiographical memory, noting differences between spontaneous versus deliberate autobiographical memories, which differ in terms of their emotional content and their vividness. So we are considering spontaneous musical imagery as sort of within the umbrella of spontaneous cognition in general. INMI, involuntary musical imagery, is internal, idiosyncratic, and unpredictable. So that suggests it might be really, really difficult to get a handle on in terms of research. But it is also vivid. Many people can describe what they're experiencing in detail. And crucially, lots of people have this phenomenon. So we're not short of people to work with. So we're interested in it because we think it might provide a model for understanding some principles of spontaneous cognition in general, because arguably it's a little bit less idiosyncratic than other forms of spontaneous cognition, and you can get people to report on specific aspects of the perceptual experience, like what tempo was it, what instrumentation could you hear, as opposed to autobiographical memories, which can be much more personal and therefore variable from one person to the next. At least somebody having spontaneous musical imagery can say, it's this particular tune, and then you can interrogate the details of that particular tune and have a look and see if it relates to some other interesting variables. So we're interested in it both as a model of spontaneous cognition, but also to see if we can kind of do a comparative study to see where it actually differs from other forms of internally generated thought. Now, it's ubiquitous, as I've said, so 90% of people have an episode at least once a week, usually only a fragment of a tune, can range in duration between 8 and 27 minutes, but of course that means some people have a little small snippet that might sort of be on a continual loop for all of that time. Other people might be reporting this because it kind of comes and goes. So this sort of figure is a little bit difficult to pin down, because there might also be differences in how much attention people are paying to their inner experience. Of course, that's a little bit of a difficult thing to account for. These earworms can come from any genre, and they can vary in their complexity. So some people can have fully blown symphonies with full orchestration, and other people will just have sort of single lines of pop melodies. Some might have lyrics, others not. And we know that people who are actively engaged with music get more earworms. It used to be said that people who are professional musicians got more earworms, but we've actually started to look and define sort of musicality more broadly than whether or not you play a musical instrument, because we think that it's a very interesting angle to look at how much you are consuming music in a sort of conscious, deliberate sense, and we find that active engagement is more important than whether or not you play a musical instrument. Now, INMI, or earworms, in terms of the evaluative aspects of them, they can certainly be helpful. This is quite a moving story, actually. We were contacted by a lady who said, at age 15, I awoke paralysed by multiple sclerosis. After returning from the hospital, still paralysed on my left side, I had a 10-day bout of vertigo that almost killed me. I lay in bed unable to turn my head without terrible spinning. For 10 days I couldn't eat, drink or get up. I went down to 80 pounds. After recovering from the vertigo, I still had the paralysis to deal with, so I sat on the living room floor and listened to music through earphones while working puzzles. I listened to music while I did physical therapy. I have had earworms upon earworms ever since. They saved my life. Dancing over and over to the songs in my head kept my body strong. I'm age 62 now and I still dance at the slightest note. A word in a conversation or on the TV will trigger earworms. I dance to the music in my head. Even in the market, I will start dancing. That's a really, really positive story. Less positively, so earworms can also hinder. This lady said, my earworm is Nathan Jones by Bananarama. First caught it in 1989 during GCSE chemistry. I've been plagued by it in moments of extreme stress, wedding, childbirth, etc. So not such a happy story. but most are evaluated either in a positive sense or in a neutral sense. Now I'll tell you how we started to do research on earworms. I was listening to the Sean Keaveney Breakfast Show on 6 Music. Anyone listen to the Sean Keaveney Breakfast Show? Okay, so you probably know that he has this slightly silly feature called earworms, and I can't believe they're still running the same feature after about 5 years or something. So they get listeners to phone in or text in or email in saying what tunes they've woken up with in their head. And then they will choose and perhaps like tell us something about why you think you've got this or how it relates to your life. And then they'll choose one of these to play on the airwaves as if to sort of somehow expunge the earworm. And I was listening to the show and thinking, well, that might actually be quite a useful source of data if they've had people actually sort of contributing their earworms. Perhaps we could somehow have a look at that data and see if we can make any sense or say anything meaningful about it at all. And I remember saying to my husband, I think I'm going to email the show and say, you know, I'm interested in the psychology of music and, you know, do you want to collaborate? And he said, no, don't do that. They'll really take the piss out of you because it's such a sort of silly show that he said they'll really mock you. But I did it anyway, and the producer of the show emailed back straight away and said, oh, that sounds interesting. Come on the show on Monday and tell us something about what you're doing and why this could be interesting for you. And that began a whole sort of series of small research projects that turned into a grant proposal that we were successful with the Leverhulme Trust. So it's one of a few examples where I've sort of opportunistically been able to use the mass media to my advantage. The first case was when I was doing work on congenital amusia, and I wrote a piece for the BBC News website, and I got people to take a little screening test to see if they were literally tone deaf, and in like one lunch hour 150,000 people took the screening test, from which I could then say I've got all this data and, you know, build kind of a research proposal around it. So these kind of the direction that my research has taken has been quite opportunistic. And sort of happy accidents, really. So we started collaborating with 6 Music, and they agreed to share their data with us. And we also, to supplement the information that we got from 6 Music, we built something called the Earwormery, where we asked people to tell us about songs that were stuck in their heads, and a little bit more information so we could start to try to understand what was going on. So the rest of the talk is a combination of research that we did sort of essentially asking people about their experiences in the wild, so as it happens, and then we kind of complement it with some lab studies where we use some kind of hunches that we get from this more naturalistic data to kind of guide our hypotheses. So the background to our first in the wild study was that in me or earworms are prevalent, ubiquitous, but little understood. Our question here was asking what personal and situational factors precede the onset of in me. And we used a qualitative approach with 2 sources of text-based data, answering the question, tell us about a recent earworm episode. So we got information both from the 6 Music data and also our earwormery survey. We used grounded theory. Some of you might know what that is. It allows us to summarize, categorize, and abstract a number of themes from text-based data, and to synthesize lots of reports in a logical and linear process. We did it with 2 independent coders and a 4-stage kind of iterative process. And this gets around the accusation that is sometimes made that this kind of qualitative approach is very prone to kind of personal biases, and that you can kind of shape the output in whatever way you want. But we tried to do it in a kind of more rigorous and robust way by having these 2 independent coders. And we distilled a lot of information down. So 2,500 reports, we distilled down into 24 themes. From the 6 Music, and then the Earwormery reports distilled 1,300 into 26 themes. And then once you've done all of this kind of coding, which is quite a laborious thing to do, you end up with a a big model like this, which, don't worry if you can't see all of the different nodes, but the size of the bubbles represent the number of themes, the number of instances of a particular theme. And the themes that we were able to identify fell into categories of exposure to the music in question, memory associations, affective states, and altered states of consciousness. So I'll go through each of these in turn and give you some examples of kind of data contributing to these themes. So let's start with exposure. So recent and repeated exposure to a particular piece of music is unsurprisingly related to getting that as an earworm. My earworm is that bloody George Harrison song you played yesterday, woke at 4:30 with it going around my head. Please don't ever play it again. Repeated exposure, DuckTales by Donald Duck and his nephews. It's driving me mad. My 3-year-old has got the DVD on repeat. I know it's not a proper song, but it's a proper earworm. So that's exposure to music, which intuitively you'd say, yeah, of course. But perhaps more interestingly are examples where people get earworms despite not having heard the tune. So an example of association can be person, situation, word or sound. My earworm is This Charming Man by the Smiths, because every time I see David Cameron, that song just appears in my head for some particular reason. Recollection. This is an example of personal mental time travel. I first heard the tune Portsmouth when travelling down a particular road in Blackpool. Now I get it every time I travel along the same road. Seldom anywhere else. When it happens, it takes about 24 hours to disappear. And anticipation, looking forward to an event. Going to Hyde Park to see Pearl Jam. So excited I might bite through my leather restraints. My earworm is still alive by Pearl Jam and has been for days. So just different examples of different aspects of memory-based triggers. So they hadn't heard the music recently. Some examples of affective states. So this could come into moods, stress, emotional surprise. So Prokofiev, Montagues and Capulets, the opening theme. I was writing an email about a distressing subject. I expect the mood of the piece matched my mood at the time. So that's an unusual one because that's a classical earworm, and then you've heard this example before, the Nathan Jones one, which is related to stress. And then emotion. I just can't stop thinking about Michael Jackson. I keep getting sadder. Man in the Mirror has been playing on my mind ever since I heard. So that was just after Michael Jackson died. And surprise, having heard some Frank Turner at the petrol station, somewhat to my surprise, the soft guitar has melted into my consciousness and regurgitated itself as an earworm. So that's all to do with affective states. And then we had another theme that was about low attention states, so dreams and mind wandering. My earworm's Mulder and Scully by Catatonia. In fact, I dreamt about running through the woods and this was the soundtrack in my head. Mind wandering. Knarn's waving flag, is that how you say it? I don't know. So wave your flag, in the laboratory doing repetitive tasks that I'm familiar with enough to go on autopilot. I'm sure nobody can empathise with that experience. Okay, so I mean, this kind of qualitative approach was giving an idea of the breadth of triggers that can precede having an earworm. And what we found is exposure to music is just one trigger for in me, but triggers can come from spreading activation within autobiographical and semantic memory, and seems to interact with mood and arousal variables, which is very interesting to me because I'm particularly interested in trying to work out what a possible function of earworms might be. Are they just epiphenomenal, or could there be something going on whereby earworms are the brain's way of modulating or matching our kind of arousal states? And I'll discuss that a little bit more at the end. So we've talked about the triggers for in me in the kind of a naturalistic way. What about people who might want to control their earworms? How would they go about that? So anecdotally, many people report trying and even succeeding in controlling their in me. We were interested in, are there certain strategies that are commonly used or, as some people have suggested, do attempts to control in me even exacerbate it? This kind of ironic control theory. And actually, if we understand what people do to stop in me, does that give us some insights into the kinds of processes that occur when in me is ongoing? So it might give us a handle on what exactly in me and earworms are. Again, we used a qualitative approach, and we asked people, when I want to get rid of my earworm, I ... And 2 sources of data again, one from a Finnish online survey and one again from the Earwormery, a different aspect of it. Again, grounded theory. We separated behaviours into those which people had said were successful versus all strategies that people reported, whether or not they mentioned that they were successful or not. In the end, it turned out not to really matter. Both models looked quite similar. And again, you see a sprawling model that came out of the grounded theory, which broke down into 2 different types of categories. People either engage or they distract themselves from their earworm. So some examples of that. So musical and non-musical distraction. So musical distraction, I sing another specific song in my head until it goes away. And in fact, people mentioned particular Cure tunes. This is not Cure as in Robert Smith Cure, but Cure in the sense of they believe that there's specific properties of individual songs that displace tunes that get stuck in their head. Whether or not that's true, we can test. Non-musical examples, mostly verbal, so TV or reading or even prayer. I have talk radio on, not music. If music comes on, I have to race and turn it off. So different ways to distract yourself. But other people choose to engage. So they either replay, I listen to the actual song on repeat, or they identify. I work out what the tune is and then I ponder why it might have appeared. So distract and engage seem to be really different ways of coping. So just some discussion points around that. So definitely we see that in me can be sometimes unwanted, annoying, disturbing, unpleasant. And we find that attempts to control in me can help. So lots of people did report success in controlling their earworms. And that contrasts with something that had been previously written. According to Wegener's theory of ironic mental control, any conscious attempt to displace or remove an earworm is unlikely to succeed, as monitoring this attempt simply represents the earworm to the individual. But we showed that that's not really the case, because there's many people taking steps to do specific things and were able to control and stop their earworms. In particular by using distraction. So using either musical or verbal distraction rather than visual or spatial makes sense because of what we know about memory. So the similarity of musical versus and phonological types of stimuli would support the idea that you can essentially displace musical representations by, for instance, verbal kinds of information. This idea of having particular cure tunes was quite interesting, particularly because we wondered, is there something that these cure tunes that were mentioned, that perhaps these tunes have something in common in terms of the musical structural features? And that's a question that we have the ability to look at because of Daniel Mullenziefen's expertise in sort of analysing melodic features. In terms of engagement, it's interesting that people report the urge to complete the tune, which relates to the Zeigarnik effect, that you need to sort of work something through in order to kind of get closure on it. And maybe that, you know, you need to get yourself out of that loop going round and round. Moving on now to talk about some lab work that was kind of inspired by these more naturalistic approaches. So in the wild, or in a natural environment, attentional state was found to be an important predictor for in-me. So remember I talked about mood, stress, emotions, but also I talked about different states of consciousness. So people tended to report having in-me while they were waking up or going to sleep, for instance. We're interested in whether or not variation in attentional state would also modulate the likelihood of having in-me in a lab-based environment. So our approach here was to expose participants to a tune and then engage them in a task of varying difficulty, and then compare the proportion of each group who got in-me. So people are exposed to a tune that we propose would get stuck, but we propose that according to the cognitive difficulty of the task that they do next, they're more likely to get in me the hypothesis was, as task difficulty increases, in me is less likely to occur. So the point being that when you've got spare cognitive resources and a sort of an idling brain, then the brain is more likely to sort of generate this internal music. Again, that's stopping short of why it bothers to do that, but at least we wanted to test whether this is actually the case. So we had a nice chance to work in the Science Museum. They have something called live science, where they invite scientists to take up residence for a couple of months over the summer and then just test the general public as they come through the door. So this is a very nice opportunity for us to test out we ran about 4 different projects at the Science Museum. Particularly, we ran a study looking at children, because the Science Museum has the greatest number of children through the doors of any museum in Europe. Actually, we weren't thinking of doing any developmental work until someone told us that, and then we thought, quick, we have to think of a developmental question very quickly. But I won't talk about that today, I'll talk about this one here. We asked participants to watch 2 film trailers, counterbalanced, and then to do a 5-minute task. Either the task was just close your eyes, don't do anything, or they saw some red and blue dots and they had to do something with those dots that was either easy, medium or hard. So in the easy condition, they just had to count every blue, they had to put a mark on the paper every time they saw a blue dot, and at the end they had to just add up all the marks on the page. In the medium condition, they had to again count the blue dots and keep a running total in their head. And in the hard task, every time they saw a blue dot, they had to count backwards in 3s from 1,000. So we'd done some work to show that these differed in terms of the mental challenge that were required of participants. And remember, the hypothesis was that we're more likely to get earworms occurring in the easy or perhaps even the medium as well versus the hard condition. So after people had watched the film trailers, and actually the film trailers were Pretty Woman and a James Bond film trailer. So they had moving images, but they also had music. And that was quite nice because we could ask people, did you know the film? Did you like the film? They weren't sort of aware that they weren't really aware that it was about music or earworms at all, because we said it was about films and attention. They watched the trailers, they did the task, and then they completed what we called a mind activity questionnaire, probing the imagery that they had experienced during that 5-minute task. And so we didn't emphasize in me above other forms of imagery like visual imagery. So perhaps you might have got images from the scenes that you'd seen in the trailers. So we asked about different forms of imagery. And we also did a follow-up where we asked people about imagery that they had experienced 24 hours later. We found out that people didn't guess that we were interested in earworms, and we also showed that the difficulty manipulation of the task was effective, so people were declining in accuracy as the tasks got more challenging. And here we show that indeed it seems to be the case that in the baseline condition, which is just eyes closed and rest, people report a lot of earworms that were specific to the trailer that they had watched. And as you go from easy, medium and hard, you get a linear decrease in the proportion of people getting in me or earworms. So our hypothesis was actually supported. We also find that the trailer with the lyrics, which was the Pretty Woman song, induced in me in more participants than the instrumental, and that we also had a recency effect such that the trailer presented last was more likely to become the earworm. So we got a high rate of induction in 65% of the people that we sort of planted these tunes in, even though it was a very covert paradigm. This linear relationship with task difficulty is reminiscent of the literature from Task Unrelated Thoughts, some work by Nili Levy and her group. I haven't really talked about the Hyman paper, so I won't really mention that, but it kind of contrasts with a similar paper where essentially they tried to do this cognitive load manipulation, but they didn't get the levels quite right. So actually what they thought was a manipulation of cognitive load wasn't, because in the very difficult case, people just switched off. It was too difficult, so it became actually a low load condition as opposed to a high load condition. So it's quite challenging to choose your levels at an appropriate point, because of course if you make things too challenging, it effectively becomes as easy, or at least as sort of not very mentally challenging, because people switch off. Okay. Right, so as I mentioned at the start, there's not very many people who are looking into earworms because it's actually quite a difficult thing to do. And we weren't very satisfied that there was actually an instrument out there that could look at individual differences in the in-me experience. So we wanted to develop one ourselves so that we could then start to relate individual differences in the in-me experience with things like brain structure and function. So we developed something called the in-me assessment scale. The idea here is that individuals can differ in the extent to which they get earworms at all, the content of those earworms, the liking of those earworms. We wanted to create a self-report instrument to capture multiple facets of the in-me experience, to develop and validate the scale and see how IMIS correlates with other forms of spontaneous cognition, also how much people do voluntary auditory imagery and people's musical behaviour as well. So we wrote a lot of items that we thought pertained to the in-me experience, and we factor analysed it, and we came up with 4 factors which were negative valence, like items such as I try hard to get rid of my earworms, it worries me when I have an earworm stuck, I find my earworms irritating. Another factor was movement. The rhythms of my earworms match my movements. The way I move is in sync with my earworms. Personal reflections, items such as my earworms result from unresolved matters, personal issues trigger my earworms, and a factor called help. I find my earworms help me focus on the task I'm doing. Earworms help me when I'm trying to get things done. So that's, interestingly, it's not just completely the reverse of the negative valence one, which you might think it would be. It seems to be a different kind of thing. So we found that this self-report scale seems to measure a quite unique construct compared to a few little existing self-report inventories, and it seems to be quite promising to start investigating the origins of in-me, commonalities and differences with other forms of spontaneous cognition, and brain correlates of individual differences, which we've started to do a little bit of. Just briefly going to go through a couple of in-progress studies and also planned studies. We're interested in looking at structural features of in-me tunes. So does any tune have the potential to become an earworm, or are there specific musical features that make a tune more likely to get stuck? We are interested in also objectively getting something a little bit more objective than people's sort of writing things in diaries about the tunes that they had in their head. And one thing that we can do is actually ask people to keep track, ask people to tap when they get an earworm. So we've just started a study. We get people to wear an accelerometer, which is like a wristwatch, over 4 days, and every time they get a tune in their head, they tap along to the beat of the earworm, and they write in a little diary what the tune was, and things like their levels of mood and arousal. So we can start to investigate whether there's a systematic link between aspects of the inner music and their state of arousal. For instance, is it the case that when you have a tune in the head, that you get it at the tempo of is it veridical to the tempo of the original recorded tune? Or do you get systematic deviation in the tempo at which you're experiencing it according to your state of arousal or your mood? So that's one of the questions that we would like to be able to ask. Can we find some brain correlates of in-me? And can we compare in me to other forms of spontaneous cognition? So let's start with the structural features. Can any tune become in me, or are some tunes catchier than others? The way we're doing this is to collect in me examples that are mentioned multiple times. So although earworms are quite idiosyncratic, and the data that we got from Six Music and also the earwormery, lots of tunes were mentioned only once. Nevertheless, there were a few tunes that were mentioned a handful of times. I mean, not a lot of times, but at least a handful of times. So is there something special about these tunes? So you might say, well, they've probably been played on the radio a lot. Maybe they were at the top of the charts, and that's why people have got them. So we're not interested in those factors. That would be kind of boring. So we wanted, for every tune that's reported a handful of times, we wanted to find a control tune that's a similar genre, artist, and similar popularity and chart success, so that we can then essentially characterize the structural features of the earworm tunes and the structural features of the non-earworm control tunes, and see if there are structural features present in these earworm tunes that are not present in the control tunes. And that would suggest, if there are such features present, it would suggest that they may be contributing to this kind of catchiness. Daniel Mullen-Siefen has developed an algorithm called Fantastic, which is not just him bragging, but it stands for Feature Analytic something or other. And it's a computational method of sort of summarizing a number of melodic features. And what we have shown, it's early days, but he has shown essentially that two features seem to be important. A tune having relatively long durations of events and a tune having relatively closely spaced events. So for instance, Waterloo by ABBA is a good example of one of these tunes that has long notes and a very sort of stepwise progression. So Waterloo, da, 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 da. So that's all very sustained compared to other pop tunes, and also it's a very sort of closely spaced step down and step back up again. And so these seem to be two features that seem to characterize these tunes that are mentioned more times than you might expect. So that's in progress. The accelerometer study, the question here is, when in me is experienced, how veridical is it to the original tune? I think I just mentioned this. Is there systematic variation in tempo that goes along with mood or vigilance? So participants tap to the beat of their earworms every time they get one over 4 days, and they provide details of the tune and the mood via a booklet. One thing that would be quite nice in this particular study is whether or not the same person might get the same tune at different parts of the day. And then the question would be, well, do they always experience that same tune at the same tempo? Or does systematic variation in the tempo of that tune have something to do with how they were feeling at that point in terms of their mood or energy levels? Now, like, one interest of mine is whether or not earworms are about matching people's mood and arousal, or are they about changing people's mood and arousal? Because we know that people listen to actual real music very deliberately and consciously, sometimes to match, but more interestingly, I think, to change them from one state to another. And so you can imagine that it would be very interesting if earworms had the same, provided a similar service, if you like. So could essentially get you from one state to another. Either you're up and you need to be more down, or you're too down and you need to be up. But you can probably imagine that it's a little bit difficult to distinguish between this matching mood and arousal versus changing mood and arousal. And I'll see if we can sort those two things out, but I'm not sure we can at the moment. Brain correlates of in me. Question here, are individual differences in me, so frequency of earworms or evaluative aspects of them, i.e. the extent to which people like their earworms or are driven crazy by them, are they reflected in differences in brain structure or connectivity? So what we've done here is we've collected data from using the IMIS self-report from participants who've already had their brains scanned, and we're looking for associations between structural variation in the brain and IMIS scores, particularly looking at the default mode network and auditory cortex and the coupling between those two things. So that's very much ongoing work. And then just lastly, what do in-me and generally self-generated thought have in common, and how do they differ? So I think one thing that's different in involuntary musical imagery versus like autobiographical memory that can be spontaneous as well is this looping temporal quality. There's probably also differences in relation to domain general processes like executive function. I don't know to what extent musical imagery is so dependent on executive function, whereas generating autobiographical memory is clearly very cognitively dependent, if you like. I sort of see musical imagery as more of a surface level perceptual thing, and self-generated thought as a bit more cognitively complex, I guess. And then it's interesting to think about the relationships between these processes and absent-mindedness, and the difference between the initiation of something like involuntary musical imagery versus its maintenance. So that might be what we're getting at when we look at frequency of earworms versus things like whether or not people want them to stop or want them to continue. So, so some people, for instance, have a really short snippet, and other people really have a very long duration of in-me. So, I mean, it's early days, but we're trying to get a little bit more theoretical in how we're thinking about earworms as opposed to just describing aspects of the experience. Just wrapping up now, I think we have been able to identify common triggers and also cures for in-me in the wild and also in the lab. We've developed a valid and reliable tool to capture different aspects of the in-me experience. And we're now developing sort of more objective ways to look at in-me in the wild and assess this association between tempo and mood and arousal. And we're starting to look at the relationship between in-me and brain structure and connectivity. And then this is, I was interviewed for Canadian television, and I was trying to explain my idea that perhaps earworms had a function of changing or matching or changing our state of arousal. And I came up with this phrase, perhaps they're like a sonic wallpaper for the brain. And I was thinking of that Windows screensaver that kicks in when you haven't done anything for a while, at the dots that kind of, you know, come like this. And I was thinking that perhaps that's what happens when, you know, the brain generates this internal music. It's a way of sort of making sure you don't dip into a state of vigilance that is, you know, it is too low for you to essentially be able to respond to unpredictable events in your environment. So this is kind of what we've been thinking about. We've published a few studies, and there's a few more on the way as well. So check out the website if you want to follow any of that up. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I promise I did have no earworm because I have no cognitive capacity to drift off. It's very interesting. Any questions?
So one of the things I do a lot of work on is deja vu, which is kind of similar in that it's unobservable, it's a subjective experience, it happens infrequently. When we do our experiments to get people to report, to try and generate deja vu, we get huge numbers of people in totally unrealistic ways. I think it's just asking them about it makes them think, oh, well, there was something going on, I was doing some sort of memory task, a bit like deja vu. So I'm wondering how reliably do you think your people, say in the Science Museum, are reporting real images and not just kind of a tune going around in my head, but not quite. I'll say it was. I'll say it was. And do you think you're getting this kind of elevated, kind of demand characteristic driven report?
I think we get that sometimes when, so for instance, if we ask people, do you get a lot of earworms? Some people say, no, I don't get very many. And then you might send them away with like the accelerometer and say, can you tap along every time you get a tune in your head? Suddenly they get loads. So probably they're on the lookout for them. It's not that in everyday life they're not getting them, but they're just probably not paying any attention to them. In the Science Museum, that study was all about the film trailers, where we'd planted a specific tune, and then at a later point we ask them about different aspects of imagery. So we're not biasing them to report a tune because they didn't know it was about tunes. We're asking them about visual imagery and things like that. So I don't think that could really account for it. And also the interesting thing about that is not whether people get them or not, but the extent to which the challenge of the task modulates the likelihood with which you get them. But yeah, I mean, these sort of experiences of consciousness are very influenced, I guess, by when you ask people to pay attention and keep track and all of that. So it's a challenging thing. One of the things that we struggled a bit with was if we want people to kind of collect or record their earworms, does the fact, like we had them singing into a dictaphone at one point, but then we thought that actually producing the earworm changes it. It's no longer an earworm, it's a sort of a production of something, and we thought that that probably changed it beyond, you know, too much. And I mean, tapping, to some degree, you could say it's a similar thing. As soon as you produce it, you've kind of changed it. But I tend to think that the tapping is less of a transformation than actually getting people to sing it. But yeah.
I had a couple of questions related to that, because you can picture someone with an accelerometer reaching day 2 and thinking, I haven't had any songs stuck in my head, I need to like come up with something for this, and then producing something voluntarily. How do you deal with that? And then also with the tapping, it's still in a way engaging, so even if it's not changing the earworm, it's like one of people's ways of dealing with it. So do you expect that that might prolong it or shorten it? How might it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. I don't think there's too much demand management going on, or sort of pleasing us and generating them, because we do explain that it's spontaneous, it's very different to voluntarily summoning up. So I don't think they're sort of misleading us, and you know, some people report very few and other people more, so I don't think of course it could be a little bit of, there could be something like that going on. You can never really never really help that really. In the second example, yeah, the tapping, we're just looking at the first bit of tapping, so I think we're looking at the first 12 taps, because my own experience of doing it as a subject was that once you've started, essentially this looping thing, for instance, once you start to tap it, it's about continuing the tune, and there's no point at which you feel like, oh, I'm not having this earworm anymore, because what you're doing is producing the tune, if you like. It's difficult to explain, but suffice to say that I think only the early portion of the tapping is a reliable indicator of what they were getting, because I think the rest of it becomes just a continuation of what they were, continuation of that first bit. It's like a continuation task. So we're just looking at that early portion.
I just want to volunteer.
Oh.
I've put 5 earworms since you started talking.
Oh, wasn't challenging enough then.
I just can't stop it now. Start talking about it.
Have you got Bananarama?
No, 5 different songs completely, but 5 songs nonetheless.
Interesting. Well, if anybody has got ideas as to why you think we get these things and why some people get them more than others, I would be fascinated to hear, because it's a little bit intriguing. There doesn't seem to be much purpose to them. So this sort of sonic wallpaper was my best guess, really, but other people might have better ideas.
So the looping thing, even though people report it's not necessarily under control, maybe it is. So we know that music activates reward centers in the striatum, and we know that other things that become addictive do the same thing. And one of the features of addiction is sometimes people don't normally think about the triggers that drive them into doing the addiction. They sometimes don't have much awareness, they sometimes confabulate. And so I'm wondering if the looping might actually be simply because it's being reinforced. It's actually rewarding.
They're enjoying it. But then they sort of
Enjoy
stop.
the context in which the music originally occurred, or so on. I know people sometimes, as you say, they report
Until they don't
that
enjoy
it's
it.
driving them mad.
Yeah.
But addicts often report that they don't want to take drugs, so they feel compelled.
Oh, that's true.
And so if you're looking at brain areas, I would maybe look at the striatum, because there may be something there as well, like a compulsion.
Okay. So perhaps for people who get a lot of looping or small snippets but for a long period of time as opposed to a longer snippet for a short period of time. Yeah, that's interesting.
And if that were true, you might expect maybe people with Parkinson's disease might not get it. There might be groups, neurological groups, that don't actually experience it.
Okay, that's interesting. I know that people with congenital amusia tend not to get them, because one woman said, I have no idea what that means to have a tune in the head, but perhaps that's not so surprising because they don't really have the hardware in place, to deal with actual musical perception. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. We've not considered that. Thank you.
So one thing I was really interested in that you mentioned is that some people report that finishing the song helps them get rid of the tune in their head. And I was thinking, in my own experience, a lot of the songs that get stuck in my head, I don't actually know the end to. It's just it's a snippet of a song that's heard on an advert or something like that. And I'm wondering if the reason it gets stuck is because of that whoever it is doesn't know how the song actually goes beyond the short bit that they've heard. And that's really catchy, so I'm wondering if it's a way that the brain kind of keeps it in the person's head so that they can look it up later or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yes, it does, that you can't get to the end, and that's why people then search on the internet. What are the lyrics of this song that I've never really known? And then they might listen to it again with those lyrics in mind, so they can get out of that loop. But I think you're right.
You mentioned that classical music was a lot less common than pop music. Have you looked at any reasons why certain populations might not be hearing classical earworm?
Well, I think it may be due to just the differences in people are probably listening to less classical music. Maybe in the people that 6 music listeners probably not listening to much classical. So it could very well be to do with that, or it may be that there's something about lyrics, because in our films and attention study we found that the Pretty Woman, but not the James Bond, was more likely to get stuck. Because I think there's a strong link to sort of subvocal rehearsal, even though you're not singing it aloud. I believe that the sort of motor planning processes that you would need to actually overtly sing something are probably engaged. So perhaps lyrics are more likely to bring that kind of process about.
Have you looked at the involuntary autobiographical memory literature suggests that for people who aren't depressed, that they're predominantly positive involuntary memories. Is that true? And then, and what's interesting is that even the involuntary memories seem to differ from voluntary memories in people who are depressed, because the voluntary memories tend to be more negative, and we don't see those same kind of patterns with involuntary memory. I wonder if there are...
Okay, so that's interesting. So it would predict that, that there would be a bias towards positively valenced, upbeat songs when it's involuntary. But if we ask people to deliberately summon a tune to mind, particularly in depressed people, you think?
It might be an interesting...
Yeah.
And I don't know if the other thing is, I don't know if you've looked at the connection between, involuntary memory and, these worms coming to mind. Because it seems like if you have a worm, I bet you'd have a lot of involuntary memories that may be triggered with you know, by the worm. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, we did. I mean, some of those examples were about memory triggers that had music within them, I suppose. So, yeah.
So it seems like that would be a pretty interesting area to merge.
Do you work on autobiographical memory?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay. So you know Daughter Berntson's work
Yes,
as well? Oh, yeah. Well, I met up with her in the summer, actually, and it's very, although it's not sort of the same kind of thing, just seeing how she's approached that and the kind of the creativity that is required to sort of dissociate these voluntary and involuntary processes is, yeah, it's kind of inspiring.
I also want to ask a question, Esther. I'm really interested in the structural feature analysis.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I know it's only preliminary, but when you kind of gave your examples, it seemed almost that it seems to be songs that are quite simple in terms of the harmonic progression, in terms of, you know, there are not a lot of expectancy violations in the music.
Oh, yeah.
So is there a link between the ease of memorizability and the occurrence of the earworm? But also, I mean, what I would assume, because, you know, emotions are very much triggered by expectancy violations in the structural features in the music, perhaps it's songs that are not as emotional or something that trigger more earworms. I don't know, both the link to memory as well as the emotionality, is there any link?
Yeah, well, we can actually, so Daniel Mullen-Siefen has got a paper out, I think it's in QJEP, looking at structural features that predict whether or not a tune that's, so he exposes people to like 40 German pop songs actually that they're not likely to know at all, and then he predicts based on his structural feature analysis which are going to be remembered versus forgotten, and it is similar features. So, and I think in general it tends to be one of the features that's come up in his work looking at so-called hit song science, so predicting sort of chart success, is actually sing-along ability, which kind of makes sense. So if it's in a range that you can sing, even if you're not actually singing it, this sort of implicit subvocal rehearsal seems to be important. And he was involved in some really fun work where, with a PhD student, Alison Pawley, whose whole PhD involved hanging out in nightclubs in Newcastle with a clipboard, writing down the songs that were the ones that got everybody on the dance floor with arms around each other, sort of chanting all together. Once she'd like accounted for the alcohol consumed and things like range of singing voice, and there were certain vocal features that seemed to predict it.
Perhaps one or two more questions anymore? Yeah,
have you looked at medication effects at all? I'm thinking obviously about suppressing intrusive thoughts and the use of, for example, low-dose SSRIs in obsessional conditions.
No, we haven't actually, but we did do a study that was looking at levels of OCD in terms of subclinical OCD and the extent to which that would predict how much people got disturbing earworms. And we found a small association between how disturbing people found their earworms and OCD, but it was quite a small association. And the reason we looked at that at all is because people like Dan Levitin and I think even Oliver Sacks had claimed that having earworms is very much like OCD, and I think Dan Levitin even might have suggested that medication that you use for OCD should be used to medicate in earworms. But I mean, with general earworms, it's not a clinical manifestation. I mean, perhaps auditory hallucinations, but there's reasons to do with peripheral hearing loss that people get auditory hallucinations. So we sort of slightly debunked that, really. But yeah, haven't done anything on medication.
Perhaps we should continue the discussion next door in the coffee room. Thank you very much.